Elias Cho had dirt under his fingernails, and he liked it that way. 211 days into the crossing, and the hydroponics bay of the colony ship Horizon's Promise still smelled like earth, like wet soil and crushed basil and the particular green smell of tomato vines that nobody had bothered to breed out of the seed stock. Elias knelt between two rows of dwarf wheat, running his thumb along a stalk to check for rust, humming something his grandmother used to sing while she hung laundry. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a diplomat. He was 34 years old. He'd been a landscaper in Ohio before the Colonial Expansion Bureau came knocking, and now he was 300 light years from home, tending crops that would feed 4,000 people on a planet none of them had ever set foot on. The ship's arboretum was quiet at this hour. Most of the colony was asleep in cryo-adjacent cycles, cycling in and out of low-power rest to conserve resources for the years-long journey. Elias liked the night shift. Nobody bothered him. Just the hum of the grow lights, the soft drip of the irrigation lines, and the wheat. He didn't hear the alarm so much as feel it. A low shudder through the deck plating, followed by the overhead lights flipping from warm amber to hard white. All hands. All hands. Unidentified vessels on intercept course. This is not a drill. Elias stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his coveralls, and looked up at the false sky of the Arboretum dome, projected stars, gentle and fake, and thought, with the calm of a man who had spent a lot of time waiting for weather to turn, well, here we go. He did not run. He walked unhurried toward the nearest muster station because panic never got a crop in on time, and it wasn't going to get 4,000 colonists through whatever was happening either. 300 kilometers away, drifting silent in the void, a very different kind of confidence was building. Fleet Commander XR Voss stood at the observation rail of the interdiction cruiser Kelvash's Judgment, watching the human vessel crawl closer on the tactical display, and allowed himself the small, private pleasure of being right. He was Threll, tall, plated in overlapping gray-blue scales that shimmered faintly under the bridge lighting, with the elongated skull and deep-set eyes that made most species find the Threll unsettling on first contact. XR had built a 30-year career on being unsettling. It was, in his estimation, an entirely reasonable career to have. "Report," he said without turning. His intelligence officer, a younger Threll named Nar Osik, straightened at the auxiliary console. Nar had been assigned to the Judgment only 4 months prior, fresh out of the Cartography and Threat Assessment Academy, and still had the eager, slightly too careful posture of someone who hadn't yet learned which regulations actually mattered. "Confirmed, Commander. Vessel matches the profile from the Cartographers Guild survey. Designation, Horizon's Promise. Civilian colony transport, human origin." Nar pulled up the file, and it scrolled across the shared display in clean, confident Guild formatting. Survey drone HX-9 cataloged the system 14 years ago. Findings were unambiguous. He read it aloud because XR liked things read aloud. It made the confidence feel earned. Target world Karsus Prime, hereafter referred to by Guild classification KP7. Flagged interdiction status, do not land. Species of origin, Terran. Assessment of approaching vessels. Minimal defense capability. No weapon signatures detected on prior contact. Crew composition skews civilian, agricultural, and technical. Recommend non-lethal interdiction. Escalation to lethal force considered unlikely to be necessary. XR nodded slowly, the plates along his jaw shifting in what passed among the Threll for a smile. 14 years old, he murmured. And nothing about this species changes in 14 years. That's the beauty of them, Nar. No hive mind evolution, no adaptive camouflage, no shifting political structures every generation like the Voxumi. Humans are humans, slow, predictable, soft. The Guild flagged the planet for ecological preservation, sir. Not military threat, Nar offered. KP7 has an unclassified biosphere anomaly. The interdiction order isn't really about the humans at all. No, XR agreed. Which is precisely why this will be simple. We are not here to fight a war. We are here to turn away a bus full of farmers before they trample something the Guild hasn't finished cataloging yet. He gestured at the display, at the slow, lumbering shape of the Horizon's Promise, A vessel 3 kilometers long, boxy, utilitarian, covered in the sort of visible pipework and patched hull plating that screamed civilian to every trained eye on the bridge. Look at it. It doesn't even fly well. Hail them. Politely. Give them the chance to comply. And if they don't comply? Exar's smile widened, unhurried, the smile of a man who had done this 100 times on 100 worlds and never once been wrong. Then we remind them why the sign says do not land. Nar sent the hail. On the bridge of the Horizon's Promise, 300 kilometers away, a woman named Elena Reyes read the translated message twice, set down her coffee and said very quietly, Captain Elena Reyes had been a colony fleet commander for 11 years, which meant she had personally overseen the landing of 6 worlds and the near disaster of 2. And she had learned in that time exactly one lesson that mattered more than any other. Never let them see you decide. She stood on the command deck of the Horizon's Promise, gray-haired, compact, unremarkable in the way that career military people often are once the adrenaline years have worn off into competence, and read the Threll transmission a second time on the main display. Unidentified vessel. You are approaching a world under Cartographers Guild interdiction. Cease approach and prepare to be boarded for inspection. Non-compliance will be met with proportional force. Proportional force. She almost laughed. Elias, status on the hydroponics bay? She said into the comm, because habit was habit, and she liked knowing her people were where they were supposed to be. Secured, Captain. Crops are fine, I'm fine. A pause. Should I be worried? No, Elena said and meant it. Stay put. She turned to her tactical officer, a broad-shouldered man named Davis Okoro, who had, in a previous career, commanded a destroyer group during the Second Colonial War. A war most of the galaxy had never heard of, fought entirely among humans, over an asteroid belt 40 years ago, and won by the side that simply refused to stop. They think we're civilians, Davis said, not quite hiding his amusement. We are civilians, Elena said. Mostly. That's rather the point. They're reading us as unarmed. We are technically unarmed, in the sense that matters to them. She tapped the display where the Threll cruiser's weapon signatures bloomed in red. Energy lances, kinetic railguns, the standard toolkit of an interdiction vessel built to intimidate first and fire second. They're going to try to force us to turn around. When that doesn't work, they're going to escalate to disabling fire. Standard doctrine for dealing with civilians who won't listen. And when that doesn't work? Elena looked at the false horizon of Carsis Prime, glowing green-blue on the long-range scan. The planet her people had spent 9 years preparing to call home. The planet 4,000 colonists had given up everything to reach. Then they're going to learn something about hull composition that the Cartographers Guild forgot to write down 14 years ago, she said. Hold position. Let them come to us. The Kelvash's judgment opened fire 11 minutes later. It was, by Threll standards, a restrained opening move, a spread of low-yield disabling charges aimed at the Horizon's Promise's engine section, designed to cripple mobility without breaching the hull. XR watched the impact telemetry with the mild, professional interest of a man performing routine maintenance. The charges struck. The tactical display lit up with impact confirmations, and then it lit up with something else. Belay that, Nar said, staring at his console. Commander, belay that, the hull shows 0 penetration. 0. Not reduced. 0. Exar's smile faltered by exactly 1 degree. Recalibrate the scanners. Scanners are calibrated, sir. The disabling charges struck true. The energy discharged. There's no damage. Nar's voice had gone tight. There's not even scoring on the plating. On the bridge of the Horizon's Promise, Davis Okoro allowed himself the faintest, grimmest smile. Ceresium lattice composite, he said, mostly to himself. Developed after the war, when we figured out we needed hulls that could survive things a hull isn't supposed to survive, not standard export tech, not on any guild database because we never told them. They're going to escalate, Elena said. It wasn't a question. They're going to escalate, Davis agreed. She keyed the ship-wide comm, and her voice went out to all 4,000 colonists, calm and level. the voice of a woman who had done this before and intended to do it again. "This is the captain. We are experiencing contact with an unfamiliar vessel. All personnel to secured positions. This is not, I repeat, not an emergency requiring evacuation protocol. Proceed calmly." In the arboretum, Elias Cho sat down on an overturned crate between the wheat rows, patted the soil off his knees, and waited, because that was what Elena's voice asked of him, and in 11 years of colony life, that voice had never once been wrong. The Kelvash's judgment's second volley was not restrained. XR gave the order himself, full-spread, kinetic railguns, aimed not to disable but to convince. It was the kind of overwhelming, decisive show of force that had ended a dozen standoffs in his career before the first shot even finished traveling, because nothing convinced a civilian crew to reconsider their life choices like the sound of their own hull screaming. The railgun slugs struck the Horizon's Promise across her port flank in a rippling line of impacts. And the Horizon's Promise did not scream. She did not even flinch. The slugs shattered against the Ceresium lattice in bursts of white sparks and drifted away as harmless debris, and on the long-range feed, XR watched his own weapons fire simply fail. Not resisted, not survived. Irrelevant. "Belay all fire," XR said, and this time there was no smile in his voice at all. "Nar, pull the original survey. Now." Nar was already pulling it, hands moving fast over the console, and the cold, sick understanding was arriving in his chest a full 3 seconds before he found the words for it. "Sir, the survey drone, HX-9. It logged this system 14 years ago. It never made contact. It observed the planet, not the species. Everything in the file about human minimal defense capability. It's extrapolated from a database entry about a species we logged as agricultural and low industrial, based on a single flyby of a farming colony 3 systems over." 14 years old, XR said quietly, echoing his own words back at himself, like a man discovering a stone in his boot. 14 years is a long time for a species that builds like this, Nar said. On the bridge of the Horizon's Promise, Davis Okoro watched the Threll cruiser go still, its weapons cooling, and said very softly, "There it is." Elena stood and smoothed down the front of her uniform. "Hail them," she said, politely. "Let's see if they're the kind that listens." What happened next took 90 seconds, and it happened almost entirely without weapons fire. The Horizon's Promise was a colony ship. It was not, whatever its hull could survive, a warship, and Elena Reyes had no intention of making this a battle. She had something better. She opened a tight beam channel not to the Kelvash's judgment, but to 3 points in the dark beyond it. Points that had been running silent, engines cold, transponders dark, since before the Threll fleet had ever entered the system. 3 human escort vessels of the kind the Colonial Expansion Bureau had quietly started attaching to every deep frontier colony mission after the Second Colonial War taught Earth a hard lesson about assuming the galaxy would be kind to newcomers, lit their engines in near-perfect synchrony and dropped out of stealth in a loose triangle around the Kelvash's judgment. They did not fire. They did not need to. Their weapons locks alone, dozens of them, precise, silent, and utterly without the fumbling hesitation of a civilian crew, said everything that needed saying. On the bridge of the Kelvash's judgment, alarms began screaming in 3 different registers at once, and Exar Voss, fleet commander, 30-year veteran of interdiction actions across 11 systems, stood very still and understood, with total clarity, that he had walked his ship into a trap that had never once looked like a trap. "Commander," Nar said very carefully, "we are being hailed." "Answer it," Exar said. Elena Reyes's face appeared on the display, gray-haired, calm, unremarkable, entirely unbothered. "Fleet Commander Voss," she said, "my name is Elena Reyes. I command this vessel and the colonists aboard it. You've fired on a civilian ship twice in the last 15 minutes. I'd like to talk before either of us decides that needs to happen a third time." XR looked at his own ship's weapons status and cooling, spent, useless, and then at the 3 human vessels holding position around him, with the patient stillness of predators who had already won, and were simply waiting to see if he understood that. "I am listening," he said. They met in person an hour later aboard the Horizon's Promise. XR Voss and Nar Osek, escorted under a flag of parley into a plain briefing room near the ship's command deck, where Elena Reyes and Davis Okoro sat waiting with 2 cups of coffee that neither Threll could drink, and no visible weapons at all. That, Nar noted, was somehow more unsettling than if there had been an armed guard at every door. "Sit," Elena said, gesturing at the chairs across the table. "I'd like to explain some things to you, Commander. Not because I have to, because I think it will save both our species a great deal of trouble later, if you understand this now instead of finding it out the hard way somewhere else." XR sat, plates along his jaw tight with the particular discomfort of a man being lectured by someone his species had assessed, 14 years ago, as harmless. "Your survey," Elena began, "was accurate about one thing. We are agricultural. We are, by most metrics your guild uses, low industrial, when measured against a species that's had starflight for 1,000 years. We didn't have it 140 years ago. What your survey missed is why we're out here at all." She brought up a display, not tactical, not military, just a simple star chart of human-settled space, dozens of small green markers scattered across a modest but growing volume of the galaxy. "Earth is a hard planet, Commander, not by galactic standards and by human standards. Ice ages, supervolcanoes. 99% of every species that ever lived on it went extinct before we showed up. We are the species that survived that. Every single human alive today is descended unbroken from an ancestor who did not quit when the world tried to kill them." She paused. "We do not consider a sign that says, 'Do not land,' to be the same thing as a wall. We consider it information, sometimes very important information. And we do listen, Commander, when we understand why it's there. But your fleet didn't lead with the ecological warning in your own file. It led with force. And here is the thing about my species that your 14-year-old survey didn't have time to learn." She nodded to Davis, who brought up a second display, a simulation, cold and clinical, showing a projected engagement between a Threll interdiction fleet of the Judgment's class and a single Ceresium lattice colony hull, run out to its logical conclusion. The simulation took 4 minutes to complete. At the end of it, the Threll fleet was gone. The colony hull had sustained cosmetic damage. Nar felt something in his chest go very cold and very quiet. "We are not telling you this to threaten you," Elena said, and her voice never rose, never sharpened. If anything, it gentled, the way you might gentle your voice explaining something sad to a child. "We're telling you because a fleet that doesn't understand what it's dealing with makes mistakes it can't take back. And I have watched species make that mistake before, Commander, and I have watched what it costs both sides. I would rather you understood us now over coffee than find out later, over a battlefield." "Your survey said minimal defense," Davis added, quieter, harder. "It should have said, this species has spent 140 years turning survival into an art form, and they will build their farms exactly as well defended as their homeworld taught them to. We're not a fleet pretending to be farmers, Commander. We're farmers who happen to be extremely, thoroughly, permanently prepared for the world not to be kind to us. There's a difference. It's a difference your guild survey wasn't built to see." XR was quiet for a long moment. "Why?" he said finally. "Did you not simply destroy us when we opened fire? You had the position. You had the advantage. You could have ended this before it began." Elena's expression didn't change, but something in it settled, old, tired, and entirely without cruelty. "Because we don't want an empire, Commander," she said. "We want a home. Those aren't the same ambition, and I'd like the galaxy to eventually understand that difference too. Killing your crew wouldn't have taught you anything. It would only have taught the next fleet to hate us instead of understand us. I would much rather you walked away from this table alive and told your guild the truth." Nar Osek said very little during the rest of the meeting. He was junior. It was not his place. But he watched. The calm woman who had not raised her voice once, the tactical officer who had run a simulation of his own fleet's annihilation with the flat affect of a man reading a grocery list, and the small human maintenance worker he'd glimpsed on a corridor monitor earlier, sitting patiently among rows of wheat with no fear in his posture at all. Because he had trusted that the people protecting him would handle it. That was the thing Nar could not stop turning over, on the long shuttle ride back to the Kelvash's judgment. Not the hull, not the simulation, the trust. A species that built its ordinary people, its farmers, its gardeners, its night shift wheat tenders, to feel safe enough to sit still during an armed confrontation, because the system around them had earned that confidence 140 years at a time. "You're quiet," Exar said beside him, staring out at the black. "I was wrong," Nar said, "about what the file meant. I read minimal defense capability, and I thought it meant weak. It didn't mean weak. It meant they'd never had to show anyone what they actually had, because nobody had ever pushed hard enough to find out." Exar didn't answer for a long time. "Draft an addendum to the guild file," he said finally. "Full revision. Every word." "What should it say, Commander?" Exar looked out at the horizon's promise, drifting quiet and undamaged in the dark, patient as a mountain. "Say that we were wrong," he said. "Say that the sign should stay up, not because they're dangerous to us, because that planet has something worth protecting. And for the first time in my career, I believe the ones asking to land it might actually be capable of protecting it with us, instead of in spite of us. Say that if the Guild ever sends another fleet to enforce an interdiction against this species, they had better send someone willing to sit down and talk first." He paused. "And say that Fleet Commander Exar Voss recommends diplomatic status be opened. Immediately. Year 1. The Horizon's promise was granted conditional landing rights within 6 weeks, not despite the interdiction, but through it, once the Cartographers Guild reviewed Exar's revised report and realized the original Do Not Land order had never been about human hostility at all. It had been about a fragile ancient biosphere on Karsus Prime that no one had wanted trampled by careless newcomers. Humans, it turned out, were very good at not being careless. Helena Reyes oversaw a landing protocol so cautious, so exhaustively survey-mapped and ecologically deferential, that the Guild's own environmental office cited it as a model for future colonization efforts within the decade. Elias Cho planted the first hydroponics overflow crop in soil that had never once touched a human boot before, in a valley the colonists named, with the sort of understated humor humans specialized in, Second Chance. Year 7. Nar Osek, promoted twice over and reassigned as the Threll Cartographers Guild's first permanent liaison to human space, stood at the edge of that same valley and watched Elias Cho, older now, grayer, still humming while he worked, teach a group of Threll juveniles how to test soil pH with their bare hands. "You still don't carry a weapon," Nar observed. "Don't need one," Elias said without looking up. "That's Davis's job." He nodded toward the ridge above the valley, where a low, unassuming watchtower sat quiet against the sky, manned always in rotating shifts, holding a modest defensive network that had never once been used offensively in 7 years, and had never once needed to be. "We don't forget the sign said, 'Do not land, Nar.' We just figured out you meant it about the planet, not about us. So we built it so the planet stays safe either way." Year 23. The story of the Horizon's promise had, by then, spread quietly through guild channels, the way stories do among species that trade in caution. Not as legend, not as propaganda, but as a case study, filed and refiled in 100 survey databases. Species human. Threat assessment. Do not underestimate based on apparent civilian composition. Recommend diplomatic contact prior to any enforcement action. Nar Osek, by then an old Threll himself, elderly enough that the plates along his jaw had gone the pale gray of long years, gave a lecture of his own to a new generation of guild survey officers, young, eager, certain of things they hadn't yet been wrong about. "You will read reports that say humans are simple," he told them. "Agricultural, low industrial, minimal threat. I want you to understand something that took me a war I never fought, and a woman who never raised her voice to learn." He paused, the old memory as clear as the day it happened. Humans do not build for the fight they expect. They build for the fight they cannot predict. Every farm has a fence. Every colony has a watchtower. Every quiet, ordinary human you will ever meet has, somewhere behind them, a species with 140 years of practice not dying. Respect the sign, respect the silence, and when you finally sit down at their table, and you will, bring your questions before you ever bring your weapons. It will save you a very great deal of trouble. On Carsus Prime, in the valley called Second Chance, the wheat still grew in long green rows, and in a quiet farmhouse at the edge of the settlement, an old shotgun still hung by the door. Never fired in 23 years, kept clean and loaded all the same. Not out of fear, but out of a simple, unshakable habit of a species that had learned, a long time ago, that peace is not the absence of preparation. It is the result of it. And for the first time, the galaxy understood what it truly meant to be human. If this story hit you, subscribe for more human stories daily.